Hello, everyone. My name is Arpan Padi, and you're watching Tech and Talk episode number 7. And today we have with us a very special guest from Paladin Cloud, Mr. John Richards. So it's an extreme honor to be with you. It's an extreme honor to share a platform with you because those of you who don't know, John has been a really influential guy in my early stages of open source contribution. He is one of the most influential people I've met in the open source community who have been given contributions, who have been given talks, who have been representing the open source, the sheer motive of open source, the sheer motive of building communities so well. So I'm pleased to have you today with us, John. Could you give us a brief introduction about yourselves?
Yes. Well, Arpan, thank you so much for having me on here. I appreciate it. And it has been a pleasure to work and collaborate with you. So a little bit about me. My background is in development. I started out as a developer, and then I did that for maybe like a decade, and then about 5 years ago, I was using open source in my development, and I really started to get into the community. I started organizing meetups, conferences, and my career shifted over into developer relations, where I got to kind of full time spend my efforts building developer communities, organizing things, and just being a part of that ecosystem. I really started to value it. So it's been wonderful to work with so many open source practitioners over the years, and it's been obviously incredibly influential to my career. But just seeing how open source can be valuable to everybody involved, I don't know, I'm a big fan of it.
Wow, that's awesome. That's awesome. I've been like, your trajectory has literally been like a rocket. So that's very interesting to observe. So for those of who don't know, John, could you please explain more about open source and how it generally works? Just like give an introduction into open source world.
Yeah. So one of the ways I like to talk about open source is around this idea of free. So open source is when you think about having goods, it's it takes cost to produce those and share those around the world. But when we talk about digital things, it's possible to replicate that without a high expense and share that out. And that enables open source. And so open source is taking code or technology and making it available to everyone. And that functions as free in kind of 3 different ways. One of those is like free as in beer, which is it's just free. If you go to an open source project out there, maybe on GitLab or GitHub, or wherever it's at, you could just go download that and you have the code and you can begin working on it. And so that free aspect is usually the first thing that entices somebody in. Maybe there's a cost restriction or something and they think, hey, I want to check out open source because it's free. But it's also free in another way, which is free as in like this idea of free speech. If you go use a kind of walled garden application, they could censor what you're saying. They might have certain restrictions in place. Whereas if you're using open source, once you download that, not only is it free in that you didn't have to pay a cost for it, but it's also free in that you can now use it however you want. And this enables folks who might normally not have a voice to be able to have a voice and speak in an area where they might be shut out otherwise. And so being able to use that in a way that you want, have a lot of flexibility, you can build your own organization or company off of that, is something that is really enabling to certain folks. I know folks who have committed to certain vendors, gone deep into a process, and then later when they wanted to switch, they were kind of locked in, or they lost a lot of data because it was really owned by that vendor. Whereas the free piece there was hey, if you had used open source, you control that, you kind of own your destiny. One analogy I've heard is a little bit like renting versus buying. You own what's underneath, and so that freedom and flexibility is really valuable. And then the third free that I want to mention here is it's free as in a free puppy or a free kitten, which is great on the surface, but it also takes some work. And so when we talk about open source, there's also this freedom that's a little bit about community. It takes some effort because you aren't paying a vendor necessarily to manage this. And there are plenty of organizations built around facilitating open source. The company I'm at, we've got open source, but we also have business relationships that work with that. But so there is, there is a way that you can kind of negate some of that. But at the end of the day, if you're using open source, it's free as in a puppy. You've got to work at it. Hopefully you get a chance to also contribute back. And that's where so much value from open source comes, is that because it's free and everybody can work on it, these communities form, people contribute back. And as they contribute back, say you're working on a program, you find a bug and you fix it. Well, you share that back to the community, and now that bug is fixed for everyone. So open source allows a community to give back, and slowly that product, that code, whatever the feature thing is, becomes better for every single person.
Awesome, awesome. I could totally relate to it. I personally feel that people who contribute to open source, they are the harbingers of having equal technology when we say in terms of the technological development that we have today, where everything is so much commercialized and so much proprietarized. The open source enables people to contribute or to use the technologies in a way that would leverage them in an initial time or in the starting phase to get started in many things. So I've been using like a couple of open source software editing apps, or
Nice.
just things like which help us to get the work done. So that's what I'm like really glad about open source. So that was a great answer. So moving on, now we know what's open source. Now, for someone who's like completely new to the tech world, like in the junior year of the college, so he wants to contribute. So what are the possible ways that he can contribute to the open source community?
Yeah, and it's a great question. Like, how do you contribute back in? Partly because contributing is also how you get better. So as you contribute, you're going to be working with other folks who are knowledgeable in this space. So it's kind of a natural space to get mentors and learn. Often these have whole communities built around this. So you get plugged in, you start to build your network and connection. So there's value there. And so so contributing goes both ways. It also lets you build your resume, your kind of career path. If you want, you could show, hey, look, I was able to contribute here. Look at this work that I did. And because these are open source projects, I've done a lot of coding work that nobody in the world will ever know because it was for a private company. I went and coded it. But any of my coding work that was for open source projects, I could send you a link and say, hey, look, here is the code that I did, because by its nature, it's open to everyone to see. So there's this extra value of when you contribute to open source. But I do want to really stress too that a lot of open source communities have really started to understand this in the last 5 years or so. But contributing to open source isn't just about coding. There's a lot of other ways to contribute. For instance, right here, Arpan, you are contributing to open source by putting out information about open source, letting people know about the value of that and the community of it. It's an incredible thing to do. So thank you for that. And so when you think about open source, there's a lot of ways that they need help. So one of the easiest ways that you could contribute is to just go submit if you have a problem. Submitting a bug, submitting a something usually on their Git repository. You could go into the issues, but if you submit an issue, that's actually helpful. Make sure it's not a duplicate. Look through, try to find something unique and share that. But if you run into a problem, sharing that problem exists is helpful. The second thing you could do is to start looking at documentation. This is an easy way. Even if you don't have a coding background, you can look at documentation. You can start to help update that, find something, and here's a great thing. Let's say, I only speak one language, English. So if it's in English, I can work on that. If you don't speak English, great. You can help write documentation in your language. Being able to internationalize a lot of this open source stuff is incredibly helpful. And I've been a part of some of the internationalization efforts on coding to help make that happen, but I don't have the skill to make that available to more folks. But if you're able to help assist with that, that's a huge thing. So internationalization is a big deal. Accessibility, part of being able to make this available to everyone. You can contribute if you want to help make things more accessible. There's a lot of standards for doing that for web interfaces. just testing things is helpful. Obviously, coding is really helpful. Now, to do coding, there is some kind of barrier. Usually, these organizations will have a contribution file in the repository. And so you want to look at that. And usually, that'll be like a contrib.md markdown file in the repository that'll explain how do you begin to contribute back to the open source project. So check that out first if you're wanting to do that. Usually, there's a issues page you can discuss in there. But usually, what you want to do if you're going to do that is to get plugged in with the community, but also just go look at their issue queues. And there's a tag called Good First Issue, I think is the right name for it, something like that, that you can look for. And if you could find that tag, those are meant to be issues that the maintainers of that project feel would be or at a level that are great for new contributors to get started. So find one of those, and even if you're not sure how to handle it, just start commenting on there. And I've seen lots of folks go that method, and it really helps you to find the folks who are working on it, build a relationship there that can grow. So lots of ways to contribute beside coding. Of course, coding is the main way, and we love when that happens. And so if you're doing that, find those first issues, just start trying it. And when you hit a problem, just share that back out, start that discussion. And that's a good way to get started. And then as you get plugged in, you'll start to meet folks, and that'll just kind of snowball.
Perfect. Amazing. I totally agree with the good first issue thing, because my first contribution itself was a good first issue. So
awesome. That's great.
Really excited about it. So now that we know like what are the ways to contribute, but I also have that the alternatives to this, like the this one is more of the free way to contribute. Like you just go on GitHub, you just search for a repository, or you search alike repositories, and then you contribute. But you can also choose to be like in an organization like MLH or GSOC or maybe Linux Foundations. Like these organizations like cater to you the projects that are meant to be like in the open source, and they are very good. So could you share more light about that? Like how can one get like started into it, or how good it is for one?
Yeah, that's a really great point. So bringing up the organizations that surround this, because what you don't want to be is just on your own and like kind of like, oh, you'll get overwhelmed. Like I've tried to contribute to projects and been just like, I don't know where to stop. And I stepped away feeling bummed that I wasn't good enough to do this. And what can I do? I've also then went to contribute to a brand new project I knew nothing about. And there was another person there who said, let me help you. They came alongside and they showed me, here's our practice for submitting an issue, or can you test this, or can you do this thing? And they walked me through. And even though I didn't know how to originally begin contributing to that project, that person's assistance made it a wonderful experience. And in a similar way, there are organizations out there really focused on open source. You named quite a few of the great ones. Part of the Linux Foundation, a great organization that covers a lot of broad open source technology. But for any open source kind of tool that you're looking for, you'll often be able to find some kind of group that levels up to that. But the value of these groups is that one, there's contributions being made, but you start to like connect with the folks in there, and they're often tackling some of the larger issues as well. Take the Linux Foundation, for instance. They've got the open source software foundation, is that what it is? OSSF, I forget the F, I think it's foundation, that is really focused on supply chain and like how do we create better security around this, and they're focused on this like specific problem in the space. So beyond just a single code, they're now putting out white papers, and they're creating more information around this. And so what that can do is not only are you working on problems like the code level, you start to elevate up and you start to deal with challenges that are facing us as entire communities, but that's a problem that faces countries and just across the world. So it's kind of taking that open source ethos a little bit and taking it up to the next level and saying, as a larger organization, we could take this idea of collectively we're smarter than individually and use that to solve some of these bigger problems. So definitely, yeah, check out some of those different groups. You can learn a lot along the way, and your contributions will mean a lot to the folks that use those down the road.
Yeah. Personally, I feel that they have a huge value because they like personally cater to you the projects that are making real world differences and having an impact in the real world. So that's a really good point. You mentioned about connecting. So when I think of connecting, so I think between the developers and the people, the users who are actually using the things. So uh, could you give a more hint about DevOps and like what it is about and how this thing came into existence? Like it particularly for me, it is something that is like in trend nowadays, but like it has emerged suddenly out of a wave. So could you give more hint about it?
Yeah, no, yeah, we love talking about DevOps. So, I started out programming, and I mean, and this is probably familiar to most folks who like your first program that you write, you like write it and you run it on your own machine and you say, look, something happened. And maybe that's just printing out hello world as your first line of code. And it's a very solo experience. It's you, your computer, and you get it to work. I remember kind of getting my first job, which was a friend asking me to build a little website for them. And so I went to their computer, and they had a little server, and I like spun something up, and we put it on their computer. And now there was two folks involved. I was writing it. They kind of told me what they wanted, and I put that up. But the moment I stepped away from that first example and started involving somebody else, things got complicated. And that's where DevOps kind of comes out, is really that process of we're not alone. We've got a group of folks doing this. So what tools do we need to be consistent? So, the next step was getting a job, and now all of a sudden it wasn't just me, it was me and another developer, and we had a designer involved, and eventually I'd have like a content person, and we were building this for a client, and so then we had their input coming in, and now all of a sudden there's this whole process. You've got to start out by understanding what the problem is, and that's part of DevOps. There's this like discovery phase, and I won't remember all the steps across, but you have this phase of like understanding what the problem is. You start building what it is. You need to do testing along the way. You need to verify those requirements. There's a process at the end as you kind of you review that to see what you learn, and you kind of have this like infinite cycle that goes on. But DevOps is really about developer operations, and it's the operations needed as you take that code and deploy it. And now it's not as simple as just on your computer. You maybe likely nowadays you're deploying this up to the cloud, and you need to make sure that you've got versioning in place to make sure that if something happens, you can roll back, and there's all these like checks and balances that need to happen. And so DevOps is really about building your skill at the almost meta part of development. You can be a great developer without doing DevOps if you're just writing code. But once you start needing to deploy that deployment part is a very complicated process. And now we have, instead of writing all of our own code, we're including libraries from other folks. And we need to make sure that those libraries are secure, that we have, a chain of a way to pull in the latest version. I don't want to write everything from scratch. And so I'm using great libraries that other folks have written, often open source libraries. But when those update, how do I get those into my project? So those are the problems that DevOps is concerned with. And it's an incredibly robust field that has only grown, and now it's continuing to grow as all these kind of spin-offs are happening. Hear about like DevSecOps now, like how do you do security in that DevOps cycle? How do you do lots of other different practices in there? So it'll be interesting to see in the next few years how this just continues to mature as a practice. But learning that, by getting plugged in with other folks, you'll start to hear about how they're doing it. So often the best way to learn is just by doing. Jump in, start to deploy some stuff and say, oh, hey, here is why I don't deploy to production. I remember deploying a site, hit the wrong button, and I took down the whole site for hours. And I was like, oh, I need a better way to do this. And, that's what DevOps is about. How do you make sure you don't mess up a piece of code and suddenly you take down everything for everyone?
Well, makes perfect sense. Like it's an amalgamation of both technical and communication skills. So you have to be great at both of them to handle the role. So yeah, makes perfect sense because some people think that DevOps doesn't have that much of technical edge, but I think that DevOps has like one of the most technical complexities, because there's an infinite cycle of continuous deployment and continuous integration. So you have to be really careful, or you have to be really, accurate with what steps you take. Like you said, this site just got down, the server just got down. So
Yeah,
that could happen.
absolutely. And we see too, so much automation is coming in that now, like, you need a lot of technical coding skills to code up the automation that you're going to do. So it used to be more just you plug in a few processes, but now, think about like infrastructure as code, like all of this. All the things that used to be a different field are slowly becoming as code. Security is code, infrastructure is code. And so now, coding is kind of consuming the world. So you need those technical skills to begin with. And then you can build on that to really add value.
Yeah, yeah, perfectly. So when we talk about DevOps, and when we talk about security as code, one name comes into our mind, that is like Paladin Cloud. So uh, could you give us an introduction into what Paladin Cloud is, and what role does in the cloud environment, or the cloud infrastructure in general, and what role do you play in it, the everyday, day-to-day tasks that you manage in it?
Well, thank you for the kind setup question there to talk just real quick about Paladin Cloud. So, Paladin Cloud is an open source project, a platform, and we have a SaaS product layered on top. So that's kind of our business model. But the open source piece, 100% free. You can go to our GitHub, download it, and use it. And what it does, you install it, and it scans all of your infrastructure. So it's a multi-cloud tool that will scan AWS, Azure, GCP, and because it's open source, it's got this plugin model. So new platforms can be added in. We've got work going on right now that includes pulling in assets from like Red Hat ACS. Roadmap has plans for like Oracle and other cloud providers out there. And it pulls all this data in. And then the security aspect is it looks for misconfigurations or connects into a vulnerability tool, pulls in that information so that you can see if you've got anything that's basically insecure or not compliant. So for instance, if you've deployed up a S3 bucket, you want to make sure that that's not public or your data could get exposed. There's been a number of high profile breaches of folks that have had an S3 bucket sitting out there, and then they didn't have it properly secured. Yep. And all of a sudden something got revealed. I remember a few months ago, the no-fly list got exposed on somebody's S3 bucket that didn't have the proper restrictions in place. So that's what it does. It scans for those, but because it's open source, you could install it in your own instance, set it up to scan all of those, and try it out. The security as code piece is around, we got a community. You can write your own policies on top of it. We've got hundreds of like best practice policies that scan these things, but you can write your own. And so we've had folks come in here to write them to plug into their specific scanning tools. If you're running, you've got different security tools in place. How do you know that it's running on everything? We had a person using our tool that was scanning their EC2 instances, and they didn't realize that they had 1,400 instances, but only 700 were being scanned. So they were missing half of their instances. And so our tool was able to show that. So that's the value of that like open source approach. You can go in and say, hey, here's the tool I'm using. I'm going to plug this in. And then it'll be able to scan and find, where that's missing, find those coverage gaps. And we've got some other features on the way that we're planning that coming up in new releases. So keep an eye out for that. But yeah, that's a little bit about Paladin Cloud.
Yeah, perfect. Because like I was really intrigued by the idea of cloud security, because data is now considered the new oil. So most of the important stuff in the world that is going on is encoded into data. So you have to be very secure. You have to be very careful with your data, because it is like one of the most useful resources. So I'm really glad that I could contribute to that project. So
yes, you did. Thank you so much for coming in and contributing. So yeah, that was how Arpan and I met. Also, if you're thinking about it, check out our GitHub and give us a star while you're there. That's our big call to action. But yeah, we're always looking for new contributors or new folks to try it out.
Yeah, mention the links of their GitHub in the description. Please check out below and just start coding. And as John said, maybe start with the good first issues that may come in handy. So do it, guys. So we have got now some questions that I have asked from the internet. So they are very curious to ask from the industry experts. So let's get started. So the first question comes in is how much or if any development experience is required for a guy to start as a DevOps engineer, or what are the criterias in the technical rule that must be met or experience that has to be gained before stepping into DevOps?
So it says role. So I get there's a little bit of difference of like skill to step in as doing DevOps versus I'm going out to get hired in DevOps. A lot of folks who got into DevOps started as a regular developer, and then all of a sudden that code needed to be deployed and they had to step into that role. And so having some level of knowledge about coding is very helpful, but isn't, like that's kind of a natural progression in there. And if you were trying to find a job in that role specifically, you would want to have some level of that to be able to say, hey, I know enough tech to be able to step into this. Now, if you're in a spot where you haven't ever done DevOps and you're kind of getting pushed into that spot, it is possible to jump in there without that. I've worked with some folks who were not primarily developers who did do DevOps. They understood architecture and the structure of that really well. And so they had kind of come in a different way. They got into like a hardware aspect, started studying like how that worked. And then as they worked on that, that became servers. And then as that moved to the cloud, they were able to transition that knowledge over. But I would say, to do specifically DevOps and you're not going to be coding, knowing a little bit, have some introductory level, explore some programming is going to help you catch some just basics that you'll want to know, but you don't need a deep level there. What you really need to do is just start understanding how the different environments works. And I recommend starting by going deep rather than broad. For instance, some folks are like, well, should I start studying AWS or look at Azure or GCP, or maybe I'm doing on-premise DevOps, but they're similar enough that you'll be able to transfer those skills once you have a deep knowledge of any one of those. And then you'll obviously need to do a little more work, but you could transfer that. But if you try to go too broad at first, you won't have deep enough knowledge to be valuable to an organization. So I recommend just picking one of those, looking at some of their, like, if you're just flat out, you're like, I'm new, I want to learn this. Pick one of those, start going through their kind of tutorials, their guides. They've all got workshops and things to learn those skills that you can take, and just start going through those, and you'll start to pick up some really important concepts that you can then leverage to kind of go into a career or get a role in doing DevOps.
Great. I completely agree with that answer, because DevOps is, as you said, it's like an amalgamation of both the roles. So you got to have some knowledge of this and some knowledge of that. So just get started. So yeah, another question asked by one of the college graduates is that how important are conferences and meetups in particular, like for exploring and building communities, or like just connecting with people?
Yeah. So it's tough to overstate how valuable they can be, but it's also not true to say that's the only way to build that network and gain that value. So at the end of the day, what's really important is that you're getting plugged into a community for a couple reasons. One is, as you get involved with other folks, their skill can help you progress. So there's kind of this mutual learning and sharing of ideas. It's also great for your career. As you meet folks, you'll learn about new job opportunities or even just entire careers that you didn't know existed. For instance, I'm doing developer relations right now, which is, I'm like a technical liaison on a little bit of the marketing side for Paladin Cloud. I go to conferences and speak, and I write articles about technical articles, things like that. I didn't know this was a job until about 4 years ago. And I was like, that exists. And I found out by being at a conference and talking to other folks who did that. So, there are roles that you just aren't aware of until you build some of that. So that's another reason that connecting. But it doesn't have to be at conferences. We found this out kind of during COVID. Before that, a lot of folks were all it's got to be in person at conferences. But as folks were forced to go digital, it became aware that, hey, you can build meaningful relationships in online only communities, folks that you've never met, but that you converse with. And so really it's about taking the time to build a relationship. This goes back to like relationship skill building more than specific a technical one. But, this whole opportunity here, thank you, Arvin, but it's only possible because of the power of the internet and building community. We haven't yet met in person. Hopefully that happens someday. It would be wonderful, but it doesn't mean that it's not valuable. So if there are conferences you can make, 100% say go do that. But if you can't, look for online communities. The power of the internet has broken down a lot of boundaries. There's a lot of groups that, I've got a friend who runs a weekly open office working hours. She just spins up a Zoom, invites all her friends to come join, and they hang out and build a community around that. And so you can build community without being at a conference, but conference is kind of like that nice fallback where you're like, oh, if I don't know how to do this well, I can just go there, know there will be people, and I can connect in. So it's kind of an easy mode, but if you work at it, you can build those same things in a lot of other ways.
Yeah, great. Completely agree with that. Online communities are the way to go in this like globalized world because
Yes.
We are getting the top of the talents or the best of the people from all around the world. So it's really a great experience to do that. And when we are talking about online communities, technology, and also like communication, all of these things, one thing that is like recently in a great trend is like remote jobs. So could you just like tell me a bit more about what are like what is a scenario of remote jobs and how open source may be a potential helper or maybe a potential way to get you started or get you hired in your first remote job?
Yeah, it's a great point. So thinking about doing remote jobs, I mean, if you're talking about open source, a lot of time, so one of the values of open source is these communities start to build. But that also means, as I mentioned earlier, open source is a bit like adopting a puppy. There's a lot of work that you have to do to put into this. And that can be, a challenge for some folks. You think about a small business that's going to use open source in a couple ways in their organization, they may not have the deep technical talent to be able to properly manage that. And what that does mean, though, is that often there are wonderful open source ecosystems that will come up with organizations that support that. And in that, there's often a lot of opportunity for folks who want to work freelance. And that is often a great way to get a feel for what you think about open source, and it also lets you set your own schedule. So if you're still in college and you're still going to school or something like that, but you're interested in this, you could put out feelers, try to find somebody doing something in an open source area you care about, and get just a couple hours to work on that project. I mentioned that's how I got started. A friend of mine, they wanted a website, building something for them, and I was able to do that. So if you could find these communities, often there's like a board of folks who say, hey, I need some help. I've got skill in one area. I need somebody with skill in another area. Maybe it's a designer looking for a developer or the other way around, or lots of different roles out there. And so looking for those opportunities can let you get a feel for working remote and build some resume experience to then get a full remote job. Because there's a couple of things, like it's important that you have enough self-drive to be able to work and deliver. When you're in the office, you have to be there. Folks know if you're not there. There's like a real obvious piece to that. But if you're not, it really requires an internal kind of motivation to be able to do it. But if you can, it's very freeing. I love, I finally got my first remote job, and it was odd at first, but it's, like, oh, hey, I can go down to the coffee shop and work from there. It is important to find ways to connect. You don't want to be where your entire life is like locked in one room. Make sure you get out and take a walk once in a while and get up and move. But yeah, as you think about building that job, look for some freelance opportunities, contribute in open source. I mean, showing up and for meetings for open source groups that often they'll be like, we're meeting every so often and we're going to talk about what needs done. That lets you build some rhythm, get the idea of like, how do you contribute to a project? How do you report back the work that you've done? Because another thing is with remote, how do you let folks know the work that you're doing? So it's important to communicate really well in a remote environment, and both you need to hear things and work on that, but also to share back what you're doing. And a lot of time, I know for me, it can be tough to like brag on yourself, but just find a way to share back and say, here's what I did. So folks know, oh, hey, this person actually is working. Look how they've contributed and made this better. So those are a couple things to think about as you consider remote and kind of how to engage in that and what skills are important.
Yeah, perfectly agree with that. Engaging with the certain communities or just getting started in open source can mean a lot, and maybe the contribution that you make in open source may be seen by some important people, and they may think that you're a great valuable asset to hire. But another
A lot of open
alternative,
source groups like end up hiring a ton of folks, just like you're saying, from within their communities as people contribute, because they're like, oh, this person already knows it really well. How do we get them on the team? So yeah, you're right.
but yeah, as you said, another alternative to this would be Showcase. So, what is Showcase? Showcase is basically a global-based platform tailored only for developers. So, it is a very specific platform where you can upload your work, your collaborations, and the projects that you have worked in, the people that you have connected with all over the world. And this specifically plays a great advantage to you when you are in an open source community or a global community, because you are able to partner with people all around the world, share with their experiences, learn from their work, and like build a stronger self, build a stronger profile of yourself. So huge shout out to Showcase, and yeah, I'm linking the website in the description. Do check
That's
out.
awesome. I'll have to check that out. I mean, it's a great segue because I was just saying the challenge with remote is how do you show the work that you did? So I'm glad to hear about a group like Showcase stepping up here so that folks can say, hey, here is the work I've done. This is why, show that value. So I think that's incredible.
Yeah, I would also like to highlight a new feature that we have introduced in Showcase, that is the Elite Developer feature. So basically, John, what we do in this is like we will find the perfect remote job for you. We will make sure that you get the best remote life that you can. You get the time span, like you get the time slot to do your things, get your thing organized, to have, not like you said, not just be in the room all day. So we're gonna do that for you. We're gonna get that tailored for you. So it's an elite club for made for the developers who want to work remotely and have great enthusiasm to get the work done, to like really contribute and make an impact to the society and the technological market. So do check out the elite technical opportunities. I'm linking it in the description too.
Awesome.
So
That's exciting.
yeah. So that brings us to the end of this podcast. It was one of the most, inspiring podcasts for me, because I've been planning this from a big time, from the first day that we had a call, and then you explained it to me about what Paladin Cloud does. We also talked with other members in the community, and like Subbu sir, like he is I think like the one of the most elegant features of open source is that you really get to interact with the people who are like way above in seniority or in hierarchy or in experience. So Subbu sir was there. He also shared his experience, and I was really motivated from that day, and I was really thinking forward to this episode. So thank you for making it possible, and thank you for giving your precious time. Always, I will try to share this content, and uh, I would like to share this content with as many people as possible, because we have created a perfect, combination of what beginner needs to get started into it. And we have also created the platforms or the ways that he can get started into. So I think that's a great contribution that we have made into the technical market.
That's great. Thank you so much for having me on. It was an absolute pleasure, and looking forward to when we get to do something together again. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the part two of the podcast is not too far away. Let's plan it.
Yes, let's do it.
Yeah. So thank you again, John. Thank you for your presence.
Thank you.